I'd like to welcome onto the stage Lunaticoin, Christian Decker, John Carvalho, Sam Golden, and Obi Nwosu.
Hello. So let's learn a little bit, because the conversation about layers is always on the table. So yeah, I would like that in this conversation we can learn a little bit what is a layer, because this is the first thing, no? Okay, layers are good for adoption, for this, for that, but what is a layer, Christian?
A layer is essentially any system, or let's start with the definition of layer that I am familiar with. For me, a layer is a system that we build on top of Bitcoin itself to facilitate the transfer of Bitcoin in a more efficient way, unlocking new use cases and providing different trade-offs to users who might not all have the same requirements. That's layers for me.
Very broad one, no?
I guess they're pretty simple. I like my definitions to actually be useful, and I don't want layer to mean anything. And so I would say a Bitcoin layer should be made out of Bitcoin transactions. And basically, it's just a way of having a separate network from Bitcoin that still does something with Bitcoin outside of the main network.
Yeah, so there's, as you can already see from the first two answers, there's a lot of disputes on the exact definition. One technical definition is that you can trustlessly go back to the main chain, to Bitcoin main chain. But nowadays, you're seeing much broader definitions for it as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Christian was saying in terms of expanding the functionality of the Bitcoin main chain as a kind of primary element of like a layer on top of Bitcoin. But I think it's really important when we think about those definitions that Bitcoin still plays the core role in what's being developed and built on top of Bitcoin as well. So I think that's the differentiation between true layer 2s, that we might talk about a bit more later, and then some of the other projects building around Bitcoin, which I think is great too, but there's a lot of argument around what the definition of a layer 2 is.
No, you said something interesting here, because I asked you what is a layer, and now you mentioned true layer 2s. So, okay, we will get there. You mentioned it a little bit, but why do we want them? Could we create like a categories of the reasons why we are looking to find more layers and use more layers? Why do we want them, and if they are important?
I think theoretically we want them because we think maybe we can unlock scale for Bitcoin. That's one of the major reasons. But we don't know for sure. We're experimenting with Lightning. And so the idea with the layer is to basically make some sort of security trade-off compared to the main chain, and make some trade-offs to see if you can get a different set of qualities that you wouldn't get in the main chain.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin has an incredible amount of potential. We know that it's still early, but in time, this could be 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, it has this potential to inexorably become a potentially world reserve asset. So that means it's not just a store of value, it will be used as a medium of exchange, and for many people, a unit of account. And we will be talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. Many of those people will live in parts of the world where privacy is important as well, and they will have complex requirements beyond just transfer. So different layer 2s or scaling solutions scale users, they scale usage, they scale capabilities, and they also potentially provide certain properties that Bitcoin doesn't have inherently or have to the level that we would want, for example, privacy.
So, so I did my PhD on Bitcoin, specifically scalability and security of Bitcoin. And I call that my arrogant phase, because I was sure we could come up with a blockchain design that would scale much, much better than Bitcoin. I was wrong. I spent 3 years designing systems that would scale better than Bitcoin, but they never did scale better than Bitcoin. And so we ended up, essentially, the last publication we did was a system that was competing with Lightning, essentially taking Bitcoin, lifting it off the chain to provide better scalability. And different trade-offs when it comes to privacy. And so it took me a couple of years to realize that while Bitcoin is the most stable blockchain there is, it's the most solid currency there is, in its current form, it couldn't reach its full potential. And so that's where we started building layers on top, because this one-size-fits-all, this use of a shared medium called blockchain, wouldn't enable the use cases that everybody was interested in. Those use cases, those interests might be very varied. And so we essentially disconnected the development of the blockchain itself from the development of the use cases. And so providing better use cases, more diversity in the requirements and the functionality that is provided, we can now reach a much, much wider audience and get Bitcoin out there used by the masses. Because if we were to stick to only on-chain transactions, it would be a very, very stable system. It would still be very valuable. But would it reach its full potential? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's good to think of that, like a layer is also a great place for experimentation. So you can experiment with Bitcoin without breaking Bitcoin.
Exactly. That was one of the core things that was frustrating while proposing all of these different blockchain improvements, is that consensus necessarily moves very, very slowly. And so we essentially don't want to touch the base consensus anymore, because that's very, very hard to change, right? Everybody literally has to agree that this is useful. And so by disconnecting yourself from having to modify the consensus, first of all, you're not risking having an impact on the consensus anymore. The system remains untouched. We don't need to change it as much as we would if we were to try to do everything on-chain. And we unlock this potential of doing truly permissionless experimentation if we want to try out some new trade-off for example.
Yeah, the maintaining like the purity of the main chain while having all of that experimentation is what makes it really exciting for me. Like, it means you can try all these things out, but you keep the powerful store of value that Bitcoin is at the core. And I think that's really good. And as you were talking about before, I think there's lots of different reasons you'd want to build layers on top of Bitcoin, different use cases, whether it's payments with Lightning, smart contracts with Rootstock, tokenization with Liquid. You've got all of these different kind of benefits that you can build on top of Bitcoin. I think that's super exciting.
But with benefits, it's important to understand common trade-offs. There is no free lunch, and different scaling solutions have different trade-offs. You should be very suspicious if someone tells you that there is a way of scaling, getting great privacy, getting great functionality with no trade-offs. That's not possible.
I would also say that we as engineers need to set expectations correctly, right? Many people have taken the idea of Lightning and say, hey, I'm saying Lightning because I work on Lightning, of course. Lightning will be the panacea that will enable 8 billion people to trade Bitcoin, and that's not true, right? Lightning can get us to 3 orders of magnitude, but beyond that, we already need to look what comes next, what comes after. And no, I'm not talking layer 3. I hate the numbering of layers because it just doesn't work out. Anyway, I think there are now technologies that are being built out complementary to Bitcoin, as Lightning was complementary to Bitcoin and complementary to Lightning. I see Fedimint, I see the Cashy protocol, I see different sidechains. And we have Lightning being used as sort of this connective tissue between all of them, enabling a system that is more than the sum of its pieces. And I think we need to go more into that direction, where instead of essentially saying, hey, my protocol is the next big thing, let's collaborate. Let's get the best trade-offs for our users. Let's tell them, be truthful about what we can achieve with these systems, and let's see how we can combine them to make a better overall experience for users.
Christian, you just said that you hate numbers in layers, and before Sam was saying that, or mentioned the concept of a true layer. And this is what I want to talk now, because, okay, now we're understanding that we want to experiment in layers for to have more usability in Bitcoin and scalability, privacy, etc. But if you go to Twitter and you look Bitcoin Layer 2, you will find 40 projects, 50 projects. Bitcoin Layer 2, it seems, is starting to become a buzzword. And everything seems that can have this label now. So I wanted to ask you, are there some conditions to be a real Layer 2? Or if something can provide an extra functionality, even if it has a shitcoin, we can accept that it's a Layer 2? What would be your thoughts on that, to help people not to fall into scams?
I think before we get to create a purity test for Layer 2s or off-chain protocols or whatever, I think we first need to have the discussion about what we as a community should define as a Layer 2, right? You can't have a yes or no answer if sort of the border is fuzzy. And just between the four of us here, we have very different ideas of what Layer 2s might, what might make a layer. And I think that's the discussion to be had before we come up with a purity test. And I think this vagueness is also what gives an opening to scammers to not so serious projects. And so I'd like to have the discussion about what is a layer and what is a true layer in the form through the definition of layers first.
I guess I would try to approach it very practically. We want, when we add terms to things, for them to be useful, right? And so when you call something a layer or a Layer 2, it's like a form of classification. And so you want to make sure it's not a purity test so much as if you have a definition where you know that something can be classified that way, now you know that thing and that group of things could now be applied in the way that the definition implies. And for example, when you mention like these 40 or 50 things calling themselves layers, well, it might be more useful to say like, okay, we have Bitcoin layers where they're actually dependent on Bitcoin, and then you have ones that like bridge Bitcoin. You have maybe these things we might want to start calling shit layers or something because they're just kind of beside Bitcoin and trying to get some of the fame and some of the interest and just use the name and use the kind of confusion of the term. But you need these terms to be useful, or like you said, people will misuse them on purpose, and then people will misunderstand them when they come into Bitcoin. I'm starting to think that maybe we just shouldn't really use the word layer all that much, because these are all just other networks that have some relationship with Bitcoin. Some of them have a direct relationship. Some of them kind of inject themselves into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has no reciprocated relationship. And some of them are just totally separate and bridged somehow, and the bridges are usually trusted.
Yeah, and some of them are not even networks, they're protocols. So there's I think when you said you searched online, you're probably referring to some sort of site which lists all these protocols and describes them as Layer 2s. Me personally, when I looked at that site, I very much hope that Fedimint doesn't appear in that list. If it does, we should try to ask them to remove it, because there's a lot of noise there, and I think it's much more about what are you doing from a user's point of view to improve their lives. We're very much working with what's available right now in the Bitcoin space and using that day to day to try and help people. So is it going to help you transfer Bitcoin at value at lower cost at higher speed? Is it going to allow you to have more expressivity? Is it going to allow you to reduce your cost per custody? Potentially in certain circumstances, certain trusted circumstances, send value around without an internet connection. These are things that are actually useful for people to know, as opposed to, is it a layer 2, 3, X? The normal person in the street, that doesn't actually translate into anything they can actually utilize.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's like useful categorization is a great step, like what is this for? But secondly, also, as you said, helping people understand the trade-offs and the trust assumptions as well is super important, because there's always going to be trade-offs and trust assumptions until there's some kind of change in Bitcoin Core, which obviously takes a long time. There's proposals for better, more trustless ways to connect to layer 1s and layer 2s. If you think about like BIP300 and drive chain stuff, could be really interesting. But until we're there, there's always going to be trust assumptions and trade-offs. And it's our role to help people understand that. And I think there are some, like you said, there's a lot of lists out there. I think some have put more thought into their definitions of what they consider a layer 2. But again, you really need to jump down into more useful categorization. Is this payments? Is it smart contracts? Like, why are you building this?
And one again, for anybody who's a builder, the graveyard of Bitcoin companies is filled with many who have had a dependency on some upcoming change on their business. Many of these changes could be great, but until they are live, they are not here. So if you're wanting to do something today, work with what is here right now.
I mean, there is a very practical way that the end users can go at it, right? If there is a new layer being proposed, don't be the first to jump on it. We're lucky enough that, unlike shitcoins, there isn't really that huge of an advantage to being first. So just sit back, enjoy the ride, and see them crash and burn. Most of these scammy layers will not survive, especially because they shouldn't have their own token, essentially. So there is no point in being first. So there's no urgency. Just take a step back, wait for people that have more insight to tell you, okay, yeah, that doesn't make sense, or it might have an application.
We're here to learn, and okay, I'm listening to you, but I have to say I'm getting a little bit confused. If I would be starting now and layers are the cool thing where I can move Bitcoin fast and so on, it's a very interesting conversation because we talk about definitions, but I'm getting confused. So I want to go back to practical things, and I want to ask you, if I'm starting in Bitcoin and somebody is helping me, a good friend, not a scammer, and is telling me, you know what, fees now are expensive, I suggest you that you are getting through here or through a layer, through a Bitcoin layer. Do we own Bitcoin? Does this friend owns Bitcoin if it's getting it through a layer?
So I very much like John's definition there. If you can permissionlessly exit and essentially retrieve your Bitcoins, then yes, I would absolutely call it a layer 2 on Bitcoin. Now the question is, what does that constitute, right? Is the ability to swap out of a sidechain without the federation knowing or without the miners knowing or having a say in it, is that trustless? We can debate about that. But I think the core principle that all of our systems have in common is that the sort of unilateral exit, the assurance that the user can get their funds out, is always there, and that is core to layers and the trust that people can put into a layer as well.
I think what's most important is that from a user perspective, you have problems that you want to solve. It could be that your transactions aren't fast enough, your transactions are too expensive, and now you have to look at what your options are. You'll find a whole field of people making claims that they can solve those problems. Most of them probably can to some degree, but then you have to go and learn what the actual trade-offs are. And so that's really where the nuance comes in. It's in, when you go to Lightning, you have more certainty that you yourself can ensure the outcome that you expect. When you start using something maybe like Liquid, you have to understand that you're trusting a group that has permissioned aspects to it as to whether you can get in, get out, use it, whether it will change while you're using it. That doesn't mean that either of those couldn't solve your problems and that one of them won't be cheaper than the other or and such, but this in the end is the user's responsibility. So I would just approach it this way. I would just say, what problem do I solve? Which problem do I need to solve? Which claims do I think sound the best match to my problem? And am I willing to accept those risks?
Yeah, I would agree with that, which is surprising. We have a lot of agreement here. I would clarify that no matter what you do, there is going to be some reduction in the trustlessness once you go to a layer. Lightning has obviously given us an example of the only true trustless layer 2. But even Lightning, which is closest to Bitcoin, if it costs you to go back on chain $5 and you've got $3 worth of Lightning Bitcoin, you cannot trust to see go on chain because it's going to cost you more than the amount you have. So there is going to be still some level of trust for that, but it's by far the lowest. And then you take it to another extreme and you're holding your money in an exchange or with one person, even if it's a big company, there's one CEO who's responsible for that. If they say jump, everybody in the organization says how high. And at that point, you're having to be fully trusted if it's one single custodian. And then there's a spectrum in between where federations come somewhere along the line. Then you may have larger federations that have been around for a longer time, like Liquid, etc.
I think there is a certain honesty we have to have here, right? And that's very much the engineering approach. I often get told when criticizing aspects of Lightning on a stage that I shouldn't be talking about that. That's your project, right? You have to shill it from A to Z. And no, that's not what I want, because that doesn't give informed end users and doesn't allow end users to make up their own decision of what is doable or not, or what works for them or not. And this one-sided thing, the one-sided sales pitch kind of look also then forces other people to essentially start trash talking your protocol because, well, they're not talking about the downsides, so I won't be talking about the downsides, and I have to sort of get adoption. And that makes for a very unfriendly space, and definitely not the kind of discussions I'd like to have. So more than happy to discuss downsides of Lightning too.
To reframe what you said a little bit, as a user, like if you really want to know and have a good indicator as to whether the thing you're considering using has, honest people providing it, just look at whether they're the best critics of it. Like really, truly, like the best critics of something are the people who understand the thing the most, despite still using it and promoting it. And so, if the critics are all on the other side, then maybe that's something to keep in mind. If the person saying they can claim to solve your problems is not the best critic of their thing, they can't say what the trade-offs are. They don't really talk too much. When they do say the trade-offs, they kind of sound like bullshit. Well, then that's a red flag.
Yeah. If they're just telling you it does everything, as you said before, it doesn't have any compromises, or they use non-caveated language. So he said, for example, in a trusted environment, we can allow you to send offline, as opposed to offline payments, instant settlement, no trust issues. That's worrying, and that language is what you should use as your barometer for the protocols or approaches you trust.
Yeah, going back to your friend as well and moving Bitcoin between layers, it might be useful to think about Bitcoin Core as this kind of like your bank vault. You wouldn't take your life savings to a conference like this, but if you want to make instant payments and buy a coffee or a beer, you might move some of that money into a second layer like Lightning to be able to go out there and do fast transactions and make payments. So again, we talked about experimentation from the side of building these layers. Also, for everyone out there, it's about experimentation in terms of trying these layers out. Don't just go all in, but like try Lightning. See if it's as easy as paying with your card. See the value of it. I think that's a really nice way of people exploring these layers without too much risk.
If you have the choice, though.
If you have the choice.
Again, if you have disposable income to have savings that are large enough to cover the on-chain fees, but for 3-4 billion people, the reality, again, this is not an uncomfortable thing to say, but the reality is they may have to exist on something other than the base layer for most of their wealth.
Yeah, that was discussed on the Slow and Steady panel earlier, and someone raised that kind of idea of like, will there be a time where base transactions costs are so high that people have to exist on those second layers? And that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure how I feel about it.
But that's very much still an ongoing area of research, right? We are trying to push the boundaries on how many people we can enable to use Bitcoin, and we're definitely not there yet, right? We still have a lot of way to go. We still have a lot to experiment. We have a lot to develop to enable these people to enable everybody to have access to this global shared medium that is very precious. And we can build on top, and we can build use cases on top that can incrementally reach more and more people. And it's all about setting expectations. That's why I say 2 to 3 orders of magnitude for Lightning, and what, right? Then we sort of need to go back to the drawing board. And there are people pushing those boundaries too, right?
And they should continue.
Absolutely.
So, okay, my friend's getting it a little bit like a clearer picture. But what I understand is that in layers we get more usability, and sometimes we talk a lot about layers for making Bitcoin more accessible. No, Obi was saying now, like there will be people that will not be able to afford Bitcoin on-chain transaction, and maybe will start saving in one of the layers to later on move on-chain, if they know that they can do that. But that takes me to what I want to ask you now, is about complexity. Because there is a lot of, it seems that when we find a big problem we cannot solve, then we think about, okay, how can we fix it with a layer? And then a lot of research goes to that layer. But in every layer, in every step, we're adding a lot of complexity. That for the user, maybe to access that layer, it's easy, or it seems easy. And of course, you explain them the trust assumptions, etc. But once they say, okay, now I accumulated, I don't know, $2,000 in liquid, and now I understood the trust assumption, I want to go to main chain, let's say, to Bitcoin on-chain. And then they start freaking out. They start to see, oh, now I need a swap, or now I need to peg out, or now, you know, and it's every layer is adding. Sometimes we're doing it to make it easier, but in the end, it seems we're adding also other layers of frictions. So what's your thought on that?
So I think there is a bit of a breathing motion going on in all of this, right? We essentially see an issue, we start experimenting, we go very wide, we offer a lot of different things that are complementary and competing. Some might die off, some might not die off, and then we sort of get back to a consolidation state again, where we pick and choose the best components to build our complementary system out of. And the same goes for our language, right? We sort of, everybody uses different terms. It's really hard to communicate in this initial state because we're all having different views of what this system looks like. And we then sort of converge again to a global interpretation that becomes easier to communicate to your friend as well. And we start seeing abstractions, we start seeing protocols being simplified. And so while it might be messy initially, I'm rather confident that we get to a place where there is a certain clarity as well in how these things interact, and we also learn how to talk about them, how to teach about them. And so I wouldn't be scared off by not being able to follow everything. Time will give us this convergence over again.
I think it's worth the research into complexity, but I think we have a ton to prove. I said this earlier, we have a lot to prove as far as if complexity can actually solve the problems that we hope they will. In the end, like, you are still limited in your layers by how much scale the base layer actually can provide. And like, for example, like when you want to, if the price of the on-chain fee keeps rising, it becomes exclusive and requiring of more trust of the layers that follow it. Like with Lightning, for example, if you can't afford to get out, then you are trusting that channel. So I think we have to be careful with complexity because it is theoretical that this solves our problems. And if we're wrong, the most likely outcome is people using something else. They come to Bitcoin, they get interested, and they hit this friction of complexity, and they say, well, I don't have to do that to use Dogecoin. And now all of a sudden you're offloading people because of that barrier that you were trying to include them because of that feature. And we don't really know if it'll express that way. We see so far, with altcoins, they're the place where they breed complexity and they want to compete on complexity. But it could also reverse at some point where if we focus too much on complexity, people might just go elsewhere because it's cheaper and easier. And we don't know if people would rather use, millions and millions of people would rather use the complexity of something like Lightning or just rather use an altcoin and make that security trade-off. I would like to avoid that very much, so I try to keep an open mind about what are all the knobs we can turn to try to get more people in here, and when is the best time to use one of those knobs, because we haven't fully proved complexity. And I say this as someone that's put a lot of effort into building things on Lightning, promoting Lightning, and things like this. I don't think that we could argue that we've proven Lightning is the way, so much as we don't have a better way at the moment, so we might as well keep pursuing this research.
So, to my mind, complexity is always a pure downside. It's a necessary evil to get us to a place where we want to be, but we should always strive for the least complex options possible. And we see that also being retroactively added to existing systems, right? To be very, very concrete, the Lightning update mechanism is very, very complex. If you've ever read the Lightning paper, oh boy, you're in for a lot of fun. And we found new and improved update mechanisms that are simpler, that unlock new functionality, but they're also simpler to explain and understand as well. So this goes both ways, right?
Yeah, and I think simplicity is something that can thrive in an environment where you start to see standards forming. So from a pragmatic point of view, what we do, for example, and others may be doing the same, is we look at what things have become standards. Bitcoin is a standard. Lightning has broad adoption, and there is some settled protocol functionality. eCash has been around as a concept for 40 plus years. So we've taken those three elements, and we've built a product which can be quite simple. And we can clearly communicate how you transfer in and out with trust assumptions and what the trust assumptions are. If you start using less settled or newer protocols, then it's going to be a more complex experience for a period of time. But over time, as they become more standardized, there's the potential for them to be simple as well.
Yeah, and if you think back over how far we've come in terms of reducing complexity for people entering Bitcoin as a whole in the last decade plus, I think everyone would agree we've come a long way. And a lot of these new scaling solutions and layer twos haven't had that same runway yet to show it. I mean, Rootstock went live in 2018, 10 years after Bitcoin, pretty much. So I think we're still pretty early in the space, but completely agree. We need to find a way of balancing, communicating with clarity without making it so simple that we aren't explaining those trade-offs and trust assumptions that we talked about before. And I think everyone on the stage is pushing. Like you said, there is no ideal solution for everything yet, and that's why it's really important we keep experimenting and collaborating to find how Bitcoin truly scales in a really trustless, permissionless way that can make it work for everyone.
We have our last 5 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, because each of you is working in one specific project, and I wanted to ask you if you are interested or excited about something beyond Lightning, sidechains, and eCash. Is there something out there? For example, we don't have anybody from ARC here, but is there something that you have an eye on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is. You should always have an eye open on what's new and out there, because you might be able to sort of backport some of that functionality. You might be able to find something that works in combination, is complementing your own system, and therefore enhances the experience that a user can get from that combination. So I'm very excited about the eCash mints and the Fedimint Cashew. I'm very excited about all of the newer, more extreme designs like ARC, for example, too. So it's never good to sort of close your eyes to the competition, because they might actually be helpful to you as well.
Yeah, I would. Well, I'm definitely very excited about eCash mints and Fedimint, but in general. There's what we do and what we're excited about. You've mentioned some names. I find the paper on BitVM just really interesting. But realistically, if we just look at Lightning, if we look at Bitcoin, if we look at eCash, to get from a paper to something that's going to be used by, and we want it to be used by orders of magnitude more people by definition, than who are using Bitcoin today, it's going to be an uncomfortable number when you look at it pragmatically, and we're measuring it in multiple years. Lightning took 7, 8, 9 years to start getting to reasonable levels of adoption. So starting the clock starting now, you're going to be waiting a decade if we're really going at a good clip. And so in that intervening time, do we want to wait for that, or do we want to work with what's happening now? So I'm excited about what I'm seeing on the ground now in communities around the world.
Yeah, a long ride for some of that stuff, exactly like you said. But BitVM, super exciting. What's cool about that is because it is all community-led open source project published by Robin Linus, everyone is jumping on that, coming up with their own kind of iterations, improvements. You've got like Snarknado, BitVMX, other stuff that's happening in the space to try and solve it faster. And it's cool because now everyone can contribute. We just need more like smart minds looking at that stuff and figuring out how it can contribute to everything that everyone is already building. But I agree, you shouldn't be waiting for this nirvana before starting to like build.
Although when there's multiple competing protocols for the same thing, never ends well for things happening faster. It's like an XKCD. Yeah. And I've got 4 protocols. I've got this new protocol that combines all those 4 together. 1 year later, there's 5 protocols. I've got a new protocol to combine them all together.
Yeah, the Dev Hack Day, there was some discussion about this, but it seemed like, anyway, sensed from who was on the stage, that a lot of the contributions, they can work within each of the different implementations. So if you're doing something, everyone else can use it and take it. And also the kind of creators didn't feel precious about their solution being the best solution. They were like, hey, if this one works better, I'll just take this and use this instead, which is positive. It's cool to see, but yeah, I know what you mean.
In the context of Bitcoin, Bitcoin, scaling, adding features to Bitcoin, I would say I'm very reserved as far as my interest in any other layers and things like this. There's not really anything that I would get excited about or promote or tell people to, dig into. I think that, like, for example, you said something like ARC. My policy is I'll check in on it every year. And if it becomes interesting, then I'll learn more and I'll pay more attention and maybe build with it. So at the moment, no, there are no layers or projects in the context of Bitcoin that I would look at that way, aside from Lightning, which is what we build with. But I would look at it something similar that way in the sense of I feel in order to have Bitcoin and Bitcoin, hyper-Bitcoinization and these things, that you also probably need a complementary web layer that is key-based as well, like Bitcoin. And so that's where I'm more excited in paying attention. We're building our own web-based, peer-to-peer, key-based protocol. There are others out there that I keep an eye on, see what's going on at Nostr, seeing what's going on in peer-to-peer web with Blue Sky and other things like this. And I think that systems like that are going to be a big part of how Bitcoin places itself in the world.
This was a very interesting conversation, and for sure I'm going to tell my friend who is just starting, and more or less he got an idea about layers, that to not check yet the BitVM paper. Because that, if we were talking before about complexity, that can go a bit too much, but it was a great conversation, and thank you for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.